Everything was a rush job. Really, my employers just acquired a much smaller concern that recently went bankrupt. I think the company probably got everything on the cheap from the administrators. Although my employer has been very successful and completely swamped with work in recent months, our management team have been in a bit of a panic trying to get their new acquisition up to speed and up and running. Consequently, we were sent there to reassign staff and oversee the installation of our company's systems. In short, it was chaos for several weeks. There was virtually no time for planning, and everything was done on the fly, right down to replacing the new owner's computer network, which was not extensive enough, and adding all the necessary wiring. In a nutshell, the 10 of us scurried around the city like blue flies during the day, and literally gathered in the bar of our hotel to plan what was going to happen the next day. None of us lived more than an hour away by train, but we all often stayed in town for those much-needed evening meetings. One or two members of the team managed to escape home to see their wives and families, but the choice of those who could afford to escape depended on what was happening that day and the next morning. Anyway, feeling pretty tired, I'd already been sitting at the hotel bar for about half an hour waiting for the rest of the team to show up when Sherry walked into the lobby. Sherry was one of the computer nerds hired by a specialized company to help set up computer systems and train staff on how to use them. And she took me by surprise when I realized exactly who had entered the bar. Sherry definitely didn't look like the nerdy girl I knew well, the one who spent all day teaching new hires how to use our company systems. Gone was the baggy sweater, calf-length skirt and glasses, replaced by a teasingly short skirt and a teasingly well-fitting silk blouse. She didn't look around and consider the establishment as one might expect. Sherry simply settled on a bar stool in order to drink. I figured she was waiting for someone, probably wondering which of my married co-workers was about to lose their way. Okay, I'll admit it. I got up from the table like a hamstring and very quickly sank down on the stool next to Sherry. "Hey, beautiful. What's a pretty girl like you doing in a backwater like this?" I asked in a sexy voice as I could muster. Sherry turned and looked in my direction, I suppose intending to give me an evil look and probably tell me where I could get off. But then she recognized me. "Oh God, Steve, stop fooling around. What are you doing here?" She grinned. "I'm staying here, Sherry," I said, gesturing for the bartender to put her drink on my tab. "Hey, I asked you first anyway. I'm meeting John, one of those electrician guys, for dinner. He lives in town and will pick me up here. I thought you computer people were all staying in Kona." "Yeah, but John doesn't need to know that, does he?" She winked at me. "Besides, the fewer people who know I'm dating, the better. I don't date co-workers from my company. It leads to too many complications. Does that explain why you hide your light in the office? I don't know how I'm going to feel about it. I guess I'll take it as a compliment. It's definitely Sherry. Now that you're sitting here, I can see your appearance and your expert disguise skills at work. Boy, you wipe up good girl. Poor John is going to get the shock of a lifetime when he gets here." She grinned. "Most of the people I teach to operate our systems are men, Steve. Let's just say they take instructions much better when they're looking at a monitor rather than trying to sneak a peek at my divine riches. Now you know the secret to my business success, Steve. Yeah, it felt pretty damn good when I realized it was you sitting there. Men, don't give me that, Steve. I'm willing to bet that you were watching my every move, and that it took you longer to raise your gaze to my face. Yes, I admit it, and who could blame me for that? Sherry, you are a fine example of your gender. It's a shame you don't date your co-workers." I smirked at her. "Steve, you've always been a charmer, even for that weirdo in the office. But remember, you don't work for the same employer as me, so technically we're not co-workers." "What a charming idea, Sherry. There's just one catch. I'm married." "Damn, just when I thought I'd get lucky," she grinned. "But if you ever get bored with married life, you know my company's phone number." We joked in the same vein for another 20 minutes, until eventually Sherry's date showed up, and when he recovered from his shock, they left together. I bought myself another drink and went back to my table in the corner to wait for my co-workers. I don't know. Probably about 10 or 20 minutes later, I went to the bathroom. While I was in there, another guy came in and started using the urinal next to mine. "Pretty girl," he commented. "Excuse me," I said, not sure I'd heard him correctly. It's always a little uncomfortable when a complete stranger strikes up a conversation with you in the men's room. You never know what his motives are, but I tried to remain polite. That girl you were talking to at the bar is very pretty, the man clarified. Yes, it is, isn't it? Are you in town on business? He asked as I started to wash my hands. Yes, we're opening a new branch in town. Married? Yes. But why do you ask? Oh, I was just thinking. Married men away from home should keep an eye on who's watching them when they're talking to pretty girls in hotel bars. By then, the guy was washing his hands and I was drying mine under the fan. I was chronically confused by him. I tried to figure out if he was a weirdo trying to pick me up or an unlikely pimp looking for business for his girls. Are you implying something? Yes. You've been to the bar 3 nights this week, and whenever you're there, so is that little shithead in the other corner. Haven't you noticed him? No. I really don't understand. What are you trying to say? As soon as you talked to that girl, he started fiddling with his phone. What's more, when you go up to your room in the evening, he goes out into the lobby and stays there until midnight. By then, we had already left, gentlemen, and the guy told me he couldn't say anything more, as he thought the goon hiding in the corner might have spotted him. He asked for my cell phone number and said he'd call me in a few minutes, then walked out the front door of the hotel. Confused, I returned to my seat at the bar, still trying to figure out why I had given a complete stranger my cell phone number. True to my word, my cell phone rang a few minutes later. It was the same guy, and he told me to just sit quietly and listen, then told me an almost unbelievable story. He went door to door for quite some time, but the gist of his story was that he had recently been stitched up by his now ex-wife. He explained that while on a business trip, he had innocently struck up a conversation with a pretty young woman sitting at the hotel bar. During their conversation, it was revealed that she had come to the bar to hide from her abusive ex-husband, whom she managed to spot on the street before he could see her. It didn't occur to my gullible new friend that sitting on a stool by the bar wasn't the best place for her to hide. If he hadn't been so fascinated by her attractive looks and history, he might have realized that the best place for her was in a dark corner. In any case, she pointed out the marks on her face and hands that made him assume someone had recently abused her, and accordingly, he swallowed her story like a hook, line, and bloody sinker. She then suddenly announced that her husband was about to enter the bar and fled through a door at the back of the room. Fearing for her safety, my new friend followed her and quickly discovered that she was trying to hide in an alcove in the hallway. He offered to get her a room for the night where she could hide out, but she insisted she couldn't go out into the hotel lobby because her ex-husband would likely see her. Yes, even I guessed what would happen next. After much discussion, it was decided that the girl would take the key from him and hide in his room, while my new friend would book her own room. He would then give her the key, and she could hide there for the night, which is exactly what happened. As soon as he gave the girl the key, she hugged him and kissed him on the cheek as a sign of gratitude. After which, he escorted her to her room and immediately returned to his own room. The next morning he did not see the girl, and treated the incident as a slightly expensive delusion of old-fashioned chivalry. Feeling quietly pleased with himself, he thought the incident was over. But it was not. A few days later, while unpacking his suitcase, his wife discovered a pair of women's underwear at the bottom of it, and then all hell broke loose. A few days later, he was served with divorce papers, and in them he discovered that a certain young woman had confessed to having sexual intercourse with him in his hotel room that night. What's more, there were pictures of him with this young woman at the bar and entering and/or leaving his hotel room. He claimed that the whole pantomime had been set up by his wife and her lover, who he later found out was her boss at the place where she worked before the children came along. Although he had no proof of this fact, nor did he have any proof that his wife had been intimate with this guy until after their divorce was finalized and they officially separated. The bastard was at her house when the judge ordered the separation, and I was forbidden to go near the house because the cow claimed I threatened her with violence. Now she has a house because I have to provide housing for the kids until they come of age. I'm burdened with child support, and the upkeep of this goddamn house. And all the while that asshole is sleeping there with my ex-wife. I understand your obvious frustration, my friend, but what does this have to do with me? I asked when he finally fell silent. "Are you sitting at the corner table you and your friends have been using all week?" he asked. "Yes." "Then try not to be too conspicuous. But there should be a young fellow sitting alone in the corner by the opposite wall. I suppose he's almost hidden from you behind that damn triffid plant." I casually glanced in the direction my new friend was pointing. Sure enough, there was someone behind the plant, but I couldn't see who. "Yeah, I think I see him." "Well, I don't know what his game is, but that little asshole is watching you, my friend. I'm just nodding at you because you seem like a pretty decent guy, and I'd hate to see you get stitched up like I did. You're very kind, my friend, but I do not intend to stray from the righteous path. Me too, my friend, and actually I didn't do it. But that didn't stop me from fornicating. For some reason, your wife must think you fornicate when you're outside the house. Never. I'm very rarely out of the house at all." "This is my first trip in over a year," I informed him. "Pretty strange, don't you think? Why else would this guy be following you? Are you following me?" "Yes, of course. He's been following you at the hotel for the last 3 nights. "Nonsense, my friend. It must be pure coincidence that we both arrive at the hotel at about the same time every evening. He doesn't live in a hotel. He goes home just after 1 o'clock in the morning. Look, I can prove it to you. Finish your drink and leave the hotel. Walk to the Plume of Feathers. It's only a couple 100 yards or so. There are a lot of entrances there, so if he's following you, as I assume he is, he'll have to follow you inside the pub to make sure you don't slip out of one of them. If you stand at the counter itself, you can watch his entrance in the mirror behind it." As I left the hotel, I walked past the other guys and told them I'd be right back. It wasn't until about halfway to Plume of Feathers that I wondered if I was doing the right thing. After all, there was a distinct possibility that I was setting myself up for a mugging or something. There were very few people around. I made it safely to the Plume and ordered a pint of beer. Sure enough, the young goon I'd risked a quick glance at on my way out of the hotel bar walked in and bought himself a drink at the far end of the bar. He then took a seat at the far end of the room from where he could watch me. A few minutes later, my cell phone rang again. Was I right or wrong? Yes, I agreed. He's standing against the wall and trying to pretend he's not watching me. "What are you going to do with him?" "The hell he knows. Well, just don't do anything stupid, like let him know you spotted him or chat up any of the backups." "Let me think about it and I'll call you tomorrow." "But what if he's, plans to rob me or something?" "No, he's not like that. I'm guessing he's a college student moonlighting at some dubious private detective agency. He certainly has no idea how to covertly spy on someone. I never noticed him. You, my friend, are too much like me. The thought of losing your way doesn't cross your mind, and so you have no reason to be constantly looking over your shoulder. Your red-haired buddy, on the other hand, is on the lookout and constantly scanning the neighborhood. I'm a little surprised he didn't notice your shadow. Yes, the red-haired coworker he was talking about is actually the office Casanova, and that's who I first suspected Sherry had come to the hotel to meet with. After finishing my pint of beer at the Plume, I walked back to the hotel via a somewhat winding route that took me along the river. I hoped I looked like I was out for an evening walk to get some fresh air. Back at the hotel, the guys were curious as to where I had disappeared to, but didn't question me. Then we got busy going over the plans for the office and discussing what we hoped we would be able to do the next day. Later, as I was leaving the bar and heading to my room, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that someone was hiding behind that damn plant again. "Are you okay?" my new friend asked, calling me the next afternoon. "Yeah, okay, but I still can't understand why this guy has to chase me. You want to know? Yeah, I guess I am. Someone has to pay that bastard, and if my wife is spending my hard-earned money, I'm going to be very annoyed. Okay, leave it to me. There are a couple other divorced husbands working in the office I've been seconded to. I'll have to stay out of sight because the creep might recognize me, but we think we have a solid plan to grab the creep and ask him what he's doing without letting on that you know he's watching you. That would be quite a feat, wouldn't it? No. The boys will trick him into thinking they were hired to watch you two and pounce on the kid. Hell, he's just a kid. He'll probably wet his pants. Either way, they'll promise him that if he confesses to them, they won't let whoever hired him know he blew the job. With any luck, He'll keep his mouth shut rather than risk losing his earnings. It was decided that I would set off again for the Constitution at about the same time as the previous evening. Only this time, the way to the river was by a very peculiar route, which led me down a dark alley. I confess, as I entered this alley, I wondered once again if I had been tricked into something unpleasant. Halfway down the alley, I noticed two dark figures lurking in the shadows. With some relief, I heard one of them say, "Keep walking, he's 50 yards behind you." I then continued my walk, and nothing more remarkable happened to my knowledge. And when I returned to my room in the evening, there was someone behind the plant again. "Well, it worked, but it doesn't make much sense," said my new friend's voice as I answered my cell phone just after midnight. "So he was talking?" "Yes, that's right. They couldn't stop him talking. Well, they seemed like big guys to me. Everyone looks like a big guy in a dark alley at this time of night, my friend. But you just wouldn't believe it. I know I'm out of my head. Your little tail should pick you up from the office every night. He should follow you around until midnight, and then when he's sure you've gone to bed, he can bugger off and go home." "That's it?" "Yes, he's moonlighting at the local detective agency as we suspected. But they're not really interested in what you do or where you go unless it's to the train station." "A railroad station?" "Yeah. You know those things go on rails." "Well, yeah, that's how I got here. There was no point in taking the car. The best part is that if you go to the station, he'll keep track of what train you get on. If it's a northbound train, he can drop you off and go home. If you get on a southbound train, well, then he has a cell phone number to call immediately." "South, you say?" "Yes, I believe you live on the south coast, my friend. I want to. But why would you get on a train going north? My sister lives half an hour from here." I guess that's bad news, isn't it?" "Yes, do you have a number for the guy to call? I'll send you a message as soon as we're done talking." "Thank you. What are you going to do, my friend?" "I think I'll visit my sister tomorrow night. Do you need backup?" "That would be nice of you. I have no idea what I'm about to get myself into. Write me the time of the train you're taking tomorrow and we'll meet you at the next station. Also, if you see my two friends, pay no attention to them if you understand me. They are complete strangers to you, and it will be safer for everybody if it stays that way." "Is that really necessary?" "These are two very angry ex-husbands, my friend. All you have to do is nod to them, and they'll be happy to take care of anything you need after we're safely on the train and back here. I'm sorry. There are CCTV cameras in all stations now, my friend. Almost indisputable when an alibi is required. I didn't recognize the phone number my tail was supposed to call. It was a cell phone number, so even if I had tried to trace it, it would have led nowhere." The next evening, after traveling one station northbound, I changed to a southbound train, and my new acquaintance was joined by a station down the line from where I had started my journey. He reported that a young man had watched my northbound train depart and then left the station, presumably to go to bed early. I saw no sign of the two large dark figures I had passed in the alley the previous evening, nor had my new friend mentioned them. We discussed, of course, what I might discover when I got home, and what we would do if no one was home. My wife didn't say she was going out, so we figured she was expecting guests at home. Well, there was always the chance that I would call and chat with her in the evening. I'd already done that once that week, and come to think of it, my wife seemed a bit distracted. She admitted to me that she was in the middle of a TV show, had turned off the sound when the phone rang, and was trying to follow the program using the subtitle function. Constance had always followed those stupid soap programs on TV, so I accepted her explanation at that point. By then, I wasn't so sure anymore. In fact, I was racking my brain trying to remember what else I'd heard in the background during the conversation. Some half-heard sound kept me on edge, and a couple times I thought that maybe Constance had covered the microphone with her hand. She also giggled at one point in our conversation, but I assumed she was laughing at something in her soap. I looked back, but at my home station, only the two of us got off the train. My new friend must have noticed that. "Don't worry, they're already here. They came by car earlier." As we walked towards my house, my companion started talking to himself. For a few seconds I thought he was crazy, but then I realized he had one of those blue teeth in his ear. Apparently he was talking to two dark shadows. He informed me that we had better stay somewhere for a while. Constance was still alone, but she was waiting for someone. When I asked him why he was so sure, he told me that 5 minutes ago she had opened the door of the built-in garage and rolled our car into the street. "Looks like her guest intends to stay all night," he commented. We spent some time peering into storefronts in an area of town where we couldn't be seen from the road until my companion announced that the game was on. We then headed toward my house. My companion stopped me from barging in like the proverbial bull in a china shop. He pointed out that tonight was probably not the first night Constance had had visitors, so there was no point in closing the stable door after the horse had galloped away. We need to give them enough time to get a proper handle on whatever it is they're about to get into. That way we can get the evidence I'll need when it comes to the trial. My companion was evidently more experienced in such matters than I, so I followed his advice. We lingered in the garden for some 20 minutes until my impatience took over. Then I crept to the window of the back parlor. Fortunately, the curtains, which Constance had been so pleased to find, had shrunk a little when she had washed them. I never had time to pull the steps apart again and to correct the frilly cords so that they closed completely in the middle. I never thought Constance was capable of such a thing. She was completely naked and kneeling between the legs of an equally naked Tony Copeland. He was one of our local councillors, no less, and a potential parliamentary candidate for his party at the next general election. Our current MP had already announced that he intended to resign. It is quite clear that Constance was committing an act that a certain former president of the United States called "do not engage in sexual relations." I disagreed with that somewhat. I only found out that the bastard's name was Tony Copeland because Constance had delivered circulars from his political party before the last local elections. Constance was not an ardent supporter of the party, but inexplicably became involved in the last local election campaign. I have wondered ever since whether Constance's affair with Copeland was the result of her working for the party during that election, or whether her sudden interest in local politics and elections was the result of her and Copeland's affair. I must admit that I will probably never know the answer to that question. I suppose I was still pondering the question when my companion pulled me away from the window. The last thing I had time to see was Constance's head rising and falling. As we moved away from the house, my companion handed me a small video camera with a lanyard around my neck. He explained that once we were inside the house, I should keep the camera pointed at Copeland and Constance for as long as possible. But if Copeland tries to attack me, I should just let go of the camera and defend myself. He reminded me that the camera will continue to record, even if it's just hanging on a shoelace. And no matter what I said or did once we were in the house, I was not to threaten physical violence to any of the perpetrators in any way. If he attacks you, smash his head in for all I care. But don't raise your hand on him first. I will keep that camera on you at all times to prove that you didn't attack him, and I will try to keep that camera on both of them at all times. 2 cameras? I asked. Yes, that's my business, selling video cameras in bulk. Didn't I tell you? You haven't told me anything about yourself. I don't even know your name. That's probably best if you decide you want the boys to do the business later. After sneaking into the garage and quietly deflating all of Copeland's car tires, we went through the fire door into the kitchen. From there, we could see and record what was going on in the living room, where Copeland had by then returned the favor to Constance. It took all the self-control and influence of a companion to keep me from rushing into the room and using the right boot to make Copeland sing alto from this day forward, or perhaps castrato. Be that as it may, my obliging friend convinced me that neither the right boot nor the carving knife from the kitchen shelf would be conducive to my own long-term well-being. In his view, HMG's extended holiday homes are places you visit, not establishments in which you'd like to spend 10 or 15 years in confinement. How the hell Constance didn't notice us standing there recording the scene, I just don't understand. Then Copeland seemed to tire of his labors and climbed on top of Constance, though she objected, saying he hadn't gotten her off yet. Personally, on reflection, I thought it was damned unsportsmanlike of him. Copeland told Constance that he couldn't hold back any longer and started fighting her off as hard as he could. Oddly enough, Constance told him to calm down and sort of hinted that he had offended her when he did this. Their conversation didn't make much sense, because Copeland interspersed almost every word he said with 2 words, "Damn bitch," and Constance repeated, "Oh, shit." In all the years I'd known her, I'd never once heard Constance use a swear word. Usually when we made love, she'd say, "Oh, God." I always took that as a compliment, but perhaps I was wrong. Copeland had been at it for several minutes when the cell phone on the coffee table rang. Copeland put the receiver to his ear and said, "Hello." Things started to look comical from there. Of course, I could only hear one side of the conversation. What the caller was saying to him, I have no idea, but I think I got the gist of it. "How did you get this number?" Copeland demanded. "No. I don't have anything I want to report to any newspaper." "How dare you, young man?" "Yeah. If you make accusations like that in your newspaper, young man, I'll get you your own damn job." Constance stopped her movements and looked at Copeland. She must have sensed something in his tone, or maybe what the reporter had told him had put Copeland out of the mood for sex, and it was affecting some part of his anatomy. "Now look at this. I'm visiting a local resident on official council business. My duties as a councilman include assisting?" "That's none of your business, young man. Her husband knows perfectly well I'm here tonight." At this point in Copeland's telephone conversation, Constance's eyes suddenly returned to the mirror on the wall, and a look of horror appeared on her face. "Steve, oh God, no. Steve!" she howled at the top of her voice. Constance's sudden cry caught Copeland off guard, and he looked up at her. I can only assume that he realized she was looking at something reflected in the mirror, because he shifted his upper body to one side so that he could see my companion and me. There have not been many times in my life when I have seen real fear in someone's eyes, but that night I saw fear in Copeland's eyes. You know, I don't know if he turned off his cell phone or not, but I do know that in a panic, he shoved Constance away from him with such force that she fell to the floor, smashing her head on the coffee table and briefly losing consciousness. I must say I've never seen anyone get into a dress uniform so quickly. Then Copeland found his jacket and threw it on. My companion shouldered me further into the living room as we continued to film Copeland hurrying to leave the house. Later I realized that my companion had led us out of the kitchen doorway to clear a path for Copeland to the garage where his car was parked. With his boots in one hand and his underwear in the other, Copeland rushed past us into the garage. Soon I heard him yell, "You bastards!" Meanwhile, my companion told me to check on Constance, but at the same time warned me to keep an eye on her while he kept an eye on Copeland. From Copeland's yelling, I assumed he had discovered that his car had 4 flat tires. Anyway, I heard the roller garage door open, and he tried to drive away. By this time, I was near Constance, who had just regained consciousness, sat up, looked me in the eye, and immediately lost consciousness. At the same time, she banged her head once more unpleasantly against the floor. From my point of view, Constance did not seem to have had a very good evening. I decided I'd better call medical help for Constance, so without taking my eyes off Constance's naked body, I walked over to our landline and dialed 3 9s. I was answered that an ambulance and the police were on their way. Indeed, I heard the sirens before I even hung up the phone. Rather oddly, I was still standing there filming a semi-conscious Constance when a paramedic burst into the hall. Time to leave my friend? My companion returned and gently nudged me toward the door. He also put sunglasses on my nose and a huge trilby on my head, which he pulled tightly over the sunglasses. I have no idea where he got these things, and I was somewhat surprised to see that he was now dressed similarly. I realized why as we were leaving the house through the garage. A television crew, local news I realized, and several reporters were waiting to pounce on us. They pelted us with unanswerable questions as my companion led me to a waiting cab. Some strangers stood between the newspaper men, my companion, and me and repeated, "My client cannot make any statement at this time." As the cab took us to the train station, I looked at my companion. "What you told me is all bullshit," I asked him. "No. My wife stitched me up like I said she would." "But her solicitor? Well, he was an asshole. You just met him this evening." "Copeland? Yes, Copeland. And last week a buddy of mine who does private investigations told me that he was contacted by one Tony Copeland and wants you to be monitored. My friend didn't like the job. It didn't make sense to him, and Copeland wouldn't explain what it was about, so he turned it down. But my friend, aware of my hostility to Copeland, warned me of his desire to be kept in the loop if you showed the slightest inclination to come home, a surprise of sorts. Well, it was quite obvious, wasn't it? It didn't take a genius to put two and two together to realize what Copeland's game was. Sorry about the press, but I wanted to make sure Copeland's political aspirations were over. I hope it doesn't do his law business any good either. Actually, once they get their claws into that bastard, I'm sure the press will forget about you and your wife pretty quickly. There's plenty more juicy dirt in Copeland's past for them to sink their teeth into. We were traveling north on the train when my companion informed me that Constance was in the local hospital, a hairline fracture of the skull thawed his companion. He then asked me if I wanted something done to Copeland when the police were done with him. I looked at him with a question in my eyes, and he explained that Copeland had found that driving a car with 4 flat tires was not easy, and he had crashed into at least 3 parked cars and ended up parked in a store window. Copeland was last seen being taken away in the back of a police van. My interlocutor, who was apparently still in contact and receiving cell phone messages from eyewitnesses at the scene, was a bit vague about the exact reason for Copeland's arrest. He simply called it a traffic violation. It seemed reasonable to me at the time. Driving a car with 4 flat tires certainly can't be legal. I later learned from television and newspaper reports that Copeland panicked when he saw the roller garage door go up and television and press people gathered outside. He was standing in the garage in his undress, and my companion was blocking Copeland's access to the switch that would close the door again. Then, a panicked Copeland jumped into his automobile and drove away. Or more correctly, tried to drive away. The brief description I read in the press said that his car was certainly on the road, but hit a television cruise van as it left my house, and numerous other parked cars as it drove down our street. Then, when Copeland tried to turn onto the main road, he apparently collided with a passing truck. It appears that the collision with the larger vehicle gave Copeland's car the momentum it needed to stampede into the storefront. Too bad our cab went the other way that night. I would have loved to see the carnage for myself. As we traveled, my companion informed me that this evening would probably be our last meeting, but he also said that if all went according to plan, I would hear from him in the future. He apologized again for the unfortunate publicity, but said he needed something spectacular to let the dogs off the chain. It was many months before I realized what he was talking about. I'll come back to it later. At one point, as our train was crossing a bridge over a river, my traveling companion threw the cell phone he was using out the window. He told me that I would no longer be able to contact him on that phone, and neither would anyone else. Keep the video camera, I have plenty of others. He smirked. What about the movie and those two? I'm sure the chip in that camera is enough for what you need, Steve. I have plans for the records in them, and I may have to interfere a little. But don't worry. Your wife's face won't end up in the papers. Who cares, said I. Yes, my friend. And I'm sorry that's going to happen. No man likes everyone knowing that his wife was a whore who hung up on him for God knows how long. It's not good for our ego, my friend, I assure you. Such is human nature. My companion got off the train a couple stops before me. He shook my hand, apologized again for the publicity, and for any other repercussions I might accidentally face in the future. He assured me that he would do his best to minimize them, but did not specify exactly what he thought might happen. One last time he handed me a business card and told me it was the card of a lawyer who was at my house. He was a good man and could be trusted. I was to use his services for my divorce if I decided to get one, and for any other unforeseen circumstances. Then the train left the station, and I never met him in person again. But I was to hear from him and see his face again. But I will tell you about that a little later. The nightman at the front desk caught me as I was entering the hotel and handed me a package marked urgent. I took it with me to the bar where, to tell the truth, I was going to eat to my heart's content. Who could refuse under such circumstances? At the bar, I tore the paper out of the package and found that it contained the packaging from the manufacturer of the small video camera that was now in my pocket, and a printed note. Essentially, the note instructed me not to get drunk. I was to go to my room and make at least one copy of the camera's memory card file on my laptop, and preferably several others on whatever media I had on hand. I also asked that I not keep the copies and the original in the same place. After sipping my whiskey and ordering a chaser, I did as the note instructed, putting one copy of the file on a DVD, which I later removed and put in the hotel safe and sending the other to my sister. I was only able to make 2 extra copies because I only carry a couple of blank DVDs and CDs in my laptop case. I suppose it was morbid curiosity that made me watch the Panamine one more time before I laid down and tried to fall asleep. In the end, I failed. God only knows what I looked like the next day, but everyone in the office tried to stay away from me if they could help it. Around mid-morning, 2 plainclothes policemen came to the office, wanting to have a quiet conversation with me. I took them to an empty office where we could have some privacy. They explained that there was a disagreement over how Constance, who claimed to remember nothing about the night before, had gotten a skull fracture, even though it was only a hairline fracture. The way they were talking, I realized that someone had suggested that I had been acting rather aggressively the last time he'd seen Constance and me together. They didn't say who had claimed that, of course, but it wasn't hard for me to guess. They refused to confirm or deny that it was Copeland. It took me a little while to find the right point in the recording, at which point I asked if they wanted a copy. Actually, they asked to take the original recording, but I told them I had no intention of letting the thing out of my possession. They eventually agreed to a copy, which I made while they were waiting, on a DVD I had gotten from one of the computer guys. While my laptop was doing DVDs, I asked one of the girls to get us some tea in the officers, and I struck up a friendly conversation about the previous few days. That is, if you can have a friendly conversation at all with a police officer on duty. They showed a lot of interest in my mysterious friend, but I think it was just curiosity on their part. The videotape proved that he didn't hurt Constance either. Actually, the cops wanted to know if Copeland could be charged, because he pushed Constance away from him quite violently. They said they would ask CPS officials to look into it. I think they were just interested in who had a grudge against Copeland and why. They said I should be on my guard, and suggested that Copeland was a pretty powerful lawyer. At the same time, they sort of hinted that they had reason to suspect that Copeland was not entirely honest in all his actions. Like sleeping with other people's wives, I remarked. Oh, and not only that, Steve, we just can't get a handle on this creep. Let's just say he's unofficially on a lot of police officers' lists of interest. But if I may say so, you seem to be taking all this somewhat lightly, Steve. What else am I supposed to do, officer? Lose my temper and start beating my chest? If I had behaved as you suggest, wouldn't you be leading me in handcuffs to your car right now? I asked. Yes, Steve, I think it would. The officer smiled back at me. I can tell you from experience that when the stew is spilled and everything turns to shit, the best thing to do is laugh, or at least try to. It really helps those who wish you distress. Both officers laughed and shook my hand as they left. In the afternoon, I went looking for a working phone booth and called a lawyer a friend recommended to me. He was expecting my call and simply asked if I was going to get a divorce right away. When I said I had no other option if I wanted to keep in the public eye in the future, he simply said he would get started, and then asked if he could send one of his staff over to me later that day. She would need to know all of Constance's details and my personal details. I asked him if I should give the woman a check to pay for his services, but he informed me that was already taken care of. Don't ask Steve, but you'll never get a bill from my services. Someone we both know intends to charge Copeland for all the expenses, and he, as you know, comes from a very wealthy family, and he's made a lot of money himself, only not all of it strictly legal. In the evening, all the crew waited for me at the bar, obviously hoping that I had calmed down enough to tell them about the evening before. By then, they had all read the day's papers. I thought it was funny that after the first morning call, I didn't see a single newspaper tossed in the office. I told them the short version. I got home and caught Constance doing a whoopee with Tony Copeland. They asked about the press coverage of the whole thing, but I denied everything I knew about how it had happened. It was the truth. I really had no idea about any of this. It was probably about 9 o'clock in the evening when my new lawyer, an extremely good-looking but also very efficient assistant or associate, arrived at the hotel to meet me. We made our way to the hotel library to meet privately. The first thing Miss Clarkson, yes, she was one of those types, told me was that she had already spoken to Constance and advised her to get a lawyer herself as soon as she was released from the hospital. It's much easier if the lawyer himself explains to him that he can't stand on his own 2 feet. Your wife doesn't want a divorce, you know? Yes, I know. Please look at all these messages she sent me today, I replied, showing her my cell phone. Did she try to call you? Yeah, but I'm pretty busy here. I suspect that's what he and Copeland were counting on. That's about right. Copeland has been stalking her for some time now. She claims he was successful just this week. But well, in my experience, people tend to be stingy with the truth when it benefits them. Well, he would hardly go to the trouble of following my movements unless he had reason to believe that he would get an opportunity to put Constance to bed. Screw, I think that's the word you were looking for, Mr. Marshall. Steve, Miss Clarkson. Everyone knows me as Steve. Very well, Steve. But I'm afraid that to everyone but my fiancée, I'm Miss Clarkson. I imagine a very handsome man and a very stoic Steve, believe me. Oh, I do, Miss Clarkson, I do. She smiled at me for the first time, changing her business-like expression, but then returned to the reason for her visit. Surprisingly, she already knew almost everything there was to know. Miss Clarkson pulled a piece of paper out of her briefcase and sketched out a list of questions. Constance and my full names, date of birth, our wedding, and so on. I saw Miss Clarkson just ticking off the correct answers she had already typed. There were a couple of minor errors, but nothing more than that. Everything was there, including the value of our house, but not the contents of our bank accounts or the details of our savings. Not that I could remember them in detail myself. Miss Clarkson then placed a form in front of me that I was to sign. It was essentially a contract that asked her boss to act on my behalf in Constance's affairs and my divorce, as well as any other legal matters, whether they related to our divorce or not, until I canceled the contract in writing. Before leaving, Miss Clarkson suggested that I call Constance and talk to her. In fact, I had verbally made it clear that I had no intention of forgiving Constance for her act. She also said that I could find Constance at her sister's house. Your house is being watched by the press. Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable if you found another place to stay this weekend, Steve. Miss Clarkson had always been a little uncomfortable addressing me as Steve. By the way, your employer is doing an excellent job and is rather vague about your whereabouts. I wondered who, and more importantly, when did they ask them to do this? After Miss Clarkson had gone, and I had been secretly questioned as to who my delightful visitor was, I went up to my room to call Constance. The guys were a little shocked when I told them that Miss Clarkson was a representative of my lawyer. None of them could figure out why she was visiting me at this hour, and even asked how much legal representation would cost me. The call was answered by June, Constance's sister. Our conversation was short and concise. All June could say was that she was personally sorry for what had happened and hoped we could remain friends. She then said she would go and get that stupid cow, forwards that I think expressed June's attitude towards her sister's behavior. A year or so later, while on my honeymoon in Malta, by coincidence, I ran into June again. But I'll tell you about that too later. The press apparently learned of my whereabouts only after I had spent the weekend with my sister and her family. My sister and her husband were sympathetic and didn't pry any details out of me. Hell, they'd probably read most of them in the papers anyway. On Sunday evening, when I returned to the hotel, I was served with a restraining order. I couldn't understand what it was about, but over the phone, Miss Clarkson explained that obtained an emergency restraining order, prohibiting me from releasing to the press any material taken that night or putting it on the internet. Come on. I couldn't make sense of all the legal nonsense they were spouting at the best of times, but at least Miss Clarkson got the point across to my thick skull. But I didn't do it, and I wasn't going to, I replied. We know, but someone else did and still intends to do everything they can to embarrass Copeland. Oops. Yes, and you can expect to be called before a high court judge tomorrow morning. But don't panic, we've got it all covered. I'm glad to hear you're not panicking. That's what you're paying us for. What can a high court judge do by sending me to jail? Well, yeah, but I told you we had it under control. Monday afternoon, I found myself in a courtroom, and a very pissed-off judge was standing in front of me. I didn't utter a word. My barristers, several dressed in wigs and robes, did all the talking. I informed the judge that an anonymous third party was in possession of 2 recordings similar to the one I had, taken at the same time. To my surprise, the police photo analyst confirmed that the images in question were not stills from the recording I had made. By the way, we are talking about 2 photos that somehow got into the hands of the national press. I believe that if Copeland had done nothing, only the less reputable and sensationalist publications would have printed them. And eventually they were, along with all the other newspapers and media outlets that were able to get their hands on these bastards. Both pictures showed Tony Copeland. In one of them, he was looking at Constance's naked body with a surprised expression on his face. In the other, he was just putting on his pants and Constance was lying naked on the floor behind him. In none of the pictures was Constance recognizable. The judge seemed to have a hard time believing that I had no idea who my mysterious companion was that evening, and practically stated so. In the end, however, he seemed to agree with my reasoning. And he reminded me, actually informed me, since I didn't understand the court order handed to me at the hotel, that there was a temporary moratorium on the release of all recordings made in the house that fateful evening. Then I was told I could go. It was a hell of a struggle to get through the crowd of reporters outside the courthouse. Copeland was able to obtain an emergency injunction on the grounds that they were in a private home, and he argued that he had a reasonable expectation of privacy. At least that's what was said. The newspapers vigorously fought the injunction against publication, and I strongly suspect they were assisted by my lawyers. When the case went to a full court hearing a few days later, the judge quickly lifted the injunction. The gist of the judge's decision was that the house belonged to me, not Copeland, and that he had no expectation of privacy within its walls, especially in one of the common rooms. And since the people who made the recordings were me and my guest, even if I didn't know that person from Adam, Copeland couldn't object to them being in whole or in part in the public domain. Well, I guess that's what the judge said. Most likely the whole machination only increased public interest in the story because all the newspapers and television news programs came out with headlines, and more than I expected, showed these 2 photos, and a few more that appeared in the following days. When the court finally acquitted them, the gory headlines and stories attached to these photos were, from my perspective, brilliant. One of them read, "Caught in the act," another read, "Cowardly retreat," and the attached story explained how Copeland calmly dressed himself while his mistress lay unconscious on the floor beside him. However, it was obvious that whoever took the footage from the video and gave it to the press was very careful in his actions. Constance's face was either cut out of the frame altogether or blurred. I think it's safe to say that after my antics with the High Court judge, things went back to normal. I worked the second week in the new office and then returned home. However, I found that I could not stay in the house, so I temporarily stayed in a small hotel near my work. In the meantime, Miss Clarkson got on the phone and told me that she had been contacted by a lawyer working for Constance. From what Miss Clarkson had told me, I gathered that Constance was being harassed by the press guys. They must have found out that she was living in June's house. Anyway, Miss Clarkson informed me that Constance's lawyer had told her that his client didn't want a divorce. But if I insist, Constance is willing to accept the terms I propose. "We told him your name wasn't Hamilton," said Miss Clarkson, actually giggling. Hamilton, repeated I, having no idea what that was supposed to mean. "Damn it, Steve, get over it. What year is it? Truff, Falker, Nelson, Lady Hamilton. Oh yeah, very funny, lied I. I had no way of knowing what Miss Clarkson was all about. In any case, Miss Clarkson told me that Constance was in a hurry to get it all over with. Perhaps she thought it would somehow lead to the press leaving her alone. But actually, I think the press switched to other matters long before the case of our divorce really came up. Although it still got a small headline on the inside pages of our local press. I agreed that everything would be divided in half, provided Constance was willing to admit that her adultery was the sole cause of the breakdown of our marriage, and she would agree to be a witness in any further proceedings I might decide to take against Copeland. Somewhat surprisingly, Constance's lawyers asked me to agree to appear in court as a witness in the case she had brought against Copeland. This confused me until Miss Clarkson informed me that it was probably a personal injury lawsuit, and that the videotape we had made, a copy of which had already been given to Constance's lawyer, would probably be enough for Copeland to settle out of court. I guess he did because I never heard from him again. The house was sold very quickly as the market was very good at the time. Constance took a few things she needed, and I put everything else in storage until I found another house I liked. But I had no time to look. Living in a hotel might not be fun, but you get used to it. Less work, no cooking, and it was cheaper than paying a mortgage. I even had free parking right in the city center. Sometimes some reporter would track me down, and I was even willing to talk to them. But they didn't seem interested in Constance and me. They all asked me what I really knew about my mysterious friend. I couldn't tell them anything, I'm afraid. But a couple of them, with whom I got on very well, confided to me that they thought there was something in Copeland that was not yet known, and that they thought it must necessarily concern my mysterious friend, and I gave their calling cards to Miss Clarkson, although by that time she claimed not to be personally acquainted with the man either. This was not quite in keeping with some remarks she had made to me earlier in our acquaintance, but she used the words, personal acquaintance. I don't know exactly. It might have been 2 or even 3 months since that fateful evening. But it doesn't really matter. Anyway, I was sitting at my desk one day looking at my computer screen as usual when my desk shook when someone sat on it. I looked to my left and saw a pair of knees covered by a gray flannel. Looking even further left, I noticed that the flannel fabric stretched almost all the way down to a pair of Nike sneakers. Looking up, I saw an oversized blue sweater topped with a tuft of blonde hair and a pair of huge black horn-rimmed glasses. "Hello, handsome boy. What's a nice gentleman like you doing in a dive like this? Ask Sherry." "Hi, Sherry. Long time no see. What are you doing in these parts?" I replied. Sherry explained that our company had become one of her employer's largest clients, and she was assigned to visit us one day a month, literally, to walk around and talk to employees in various departments, just to see if there were any program changes they could suggest to make their lives easier. "So what can I do for you?" "I'm fine with it as it is." "Yeah, you'd be the first to let them know if you weren't happy." "No, Steve, I'm here to collect a debt." I have no idea what expression appeared on my face, but it caused Sherry to giggle. "Hey, handsome, you owe me dinner." "Really?" "Yes, that's right. You told me you couldn't ask me to dinner because you're a married man. And from what I read in the papers, you're not married anymore." "Yeah? Well, not as verbose, but the gist of what you said in the hotel bar that night was exactly that." "Yes?" By this time, I was trying to keep a confused expression on my face. "Come on, Steve. Will you stop fooling around? I can't remember what you said to me that night." "Steve? All right, beautiful." "I haven't been outside in weeks. This will do me good. Where do you want to go?" "Oh, nothing much. I have to catch a train home just after 9. What a disappointment." "Dinner," I said to Steve. "Behave yourself. Damn, why do you pretty boys always talk like that? I'll be in the waiting room when you pass out." She grinned. Then she slid off my desk and left the department. As before, Sherry's transformation was amazing. It was impossible not to notice her as I stepped off the elevator. I don't think any of the men who passed through the waiting room while she waited for me could have missed her, and probably wished she had waited for him. The 2 guards she spoke with, both late 50s or early 60s, were clearly fascinated by Sherry. As I approached, she pulled away from them and took my hand. "Where are we going?" she asked. "First to the hotel I need to change. No time, handsome, we have less than 4 hours. My train leaves at 9. "But no but, Steve. We have a lot to talk about." I agreed, and accompanied by one of the guards who insisted on carrying Sherry's bag, we walked to my car. Stuffing my briefcase and Sherry's briefcase in the trunk, I drove us to a public house outside of town where I knew food was served all day. We talked for a while and ate leisurely. Sherry was not so much demanding as inviting me to speak my mind and share my thoughts. I don't know what it was about Sherry, but I felt I could talk to her, and I knew instinctively that what I said wouldn't be public knowledge the next day. When I spoke up, Sherry took me by surprise by going on the offensive and telling me why she had lured me out of my evening meal. Steve, you've got to do something about yourself, my friend. All the female co-workers in the office say that you are no longer the fun-loving guy you used to be. Of course, they all admit that they can't blame you for the circumstances. But frankly, they'd like to see some sign that the old Steve is still in you. I'm not with you, Sherry. No, I don't think you see it yourself. Steve, you've always been fun to work with. Even I realized that when we worked on the same projects, 4 or 5 times, and even then we never worked closely together. You do realize that for years now, all the women in your company have been turning to good old Steve in logistics and planning with their man problems. And from what I've heard, some of the guys have been coming to you for advice about their wives and girlfriends too. That's news to me. Anyway, even if they are, I don't have what you'd call a good track record in marital relations anymore, do I? Silly Steve, everyone came to you because you showed them how to laugh. Well, at least see the funny side and laugh at things. Apparently, you were an ace at advising girls on what to get their men for birthdays and Christmas. And you didn't hesitate to advise them to dump those with no hope of success. Nor were you bad at telling them how to dump them. Did you know, for example, that unofficially the HR girls tell new girls that if they have a problem with any of the office giglios and don't want to file a formal complaint, they should find you and have a chat? This is news to me, but I can remember. Yes, I suspect you can. But Steve, everyone is afraid to say even 2 words to you now. They say you walk around the office like a bear with a sore head. They miss the old Steve, the one you can laugh and joke with. Look, we all understand that you're upset, but living in this damn hotel and not going anywhere? Well, it's just not right, not for you anyway. You need to get out and, start dating again. There are plenty of eligible women in the office. Sherry, I think I know what you're talking about. But didn't you tell me that going out with coworkers is bad news? Besides, we're going out tonight, aren't we? Yeah, we're having dinner, and I asked you out, remember? Yeah, but who's going to end up paying? I smirked back at her. See, this is the Steve that girls can't get enough of at the office. The guy who sees the funny side of everything, even if I'm about to order the most expensive dessert on the menu. Sherry smiled back at me. I see your point, and will try to leave my personal problems at home from now on. Do something better, Steve. Get yourself a nice apartment or something and go out in the evenings. Even risk asking out some of the eligible women in the office. Look, I avoid coworkers at work because, well, sometimes I can look a little cheap when I dress up to go out and have fun. Some Romeos take it the wrong way and think I'm easy. I'm sure you know what I mean. And like I said, trying to teach the average man how to use a computer program when he looks at my cleavage is usually not very successful. I've seen it firsthand. I, of course, challenged Sherry and told her she could never look cheap, and we both smirked at each other. Then Sherry ordered her dessert, not the most expensive one on the menu, by the way. Oddly enough, after that we started talking about Sherry's life and aspirations. I learned that she was 22 years old. To be honest, I had always assumed she was around 19, which was a bit silly of me. I first met Sherry when we were opening an office in Wales about 18 months before, and she already knew her onions then. For some reason, perhaps because of the way she dressed, I thought of her as a perpetual teenager. The first time I saw Sherry dressed for going out was the night I told you about when she was meeting that young electrician in the hotel bar. I drove Sherry to the train station to catch her train, and she thanked me for a good dinner and a nice evening. Then, getting on her train, she said we should do it again sometime. I guess I agreed with her. The next day in the office, I tried my best to put a smile on my face when I remembered it. You know, it must have worked. I noticed that after a day or so, people stopped leaving the tea room as soon as I crossed the threshold, and the people who had avoided my desk since then, well, they didn't do that anymore and often stopped to pass the time. That same lunch hour, I visited some real estate agents and got a list of furnished apartments for rent. I guess I was still a little shy about buying, and if independent apartment living didn't work out, I could always go back to the hotel again. I guess that was the thought that was floating around in my head. That Thursday, I received an interesting call from Miss Clarkson. How's 250,000 sounds, Steve? Those were the first words she said to me. I'm sorry, but I'm not with you, Miss Clarkson. Copeland apparently isn't thrilled with everything the press says about him. The man has something to hide. Anyway, things are quieting down in the press, and we thought it would be a good time to hint that the attachment alienation case may be in full swing. I suspect Constance's legal advisors have also threatened something, but I can't be sure. Anyway, Copeland's people came back with an offer of $50,000 for us to leave. We discussed that offer, and now it's up to $250,000. We might even be able to squeeze another 25 or so out of these creeps if we nail them to the wall. Go ahead, Miss Clarkson. Take every penny you can from that scoundrel, but preferably settle out of court. Constance is not my favorite person in the world at the moment, but if I disgrace her in court, it will not leave me indifferent. Very good, Steve. The press will probably find out about it anyway, but you know the form, an undisclosed amount. It's almost as good as if Copeland had admitted that he... Yes, I was going to use your description of him for a moment. Not a week later, Miss Clarkson informed me that I would be £300,000 richer as soon as I signed on the dotted line. I went there at once and put my signature on it. While I was doing this, Miss Clarkson hinted that Constance might soon be buying herself a new house and that she would probably pay cash for it. Miss Clarkson still wasn't sure on what basis Constance had stitched up Copeland, but she suspected that it was probably a personal grudge. After a week or so, I moved into a perfectly acceptable apartment. It was further away from my office, but it came with free parking, which was at a premium in that neighborhood. It was a 2-bedroom suite with a large living dining room and a surprisingly spacious, well-equipped kitchenette. The washer and dryer were in the bathroom, but the room was large enough that you hardly noticed them. I don't know if it was the money Copeland put in my bank accounts or the fact that I tried to take Sherry's advice, but by the end of the month, I was feeling much better, and every now and then I'd go for a drink after work with one of the guys. There were 3 people sitting at my desk, a coworker who had been with the company for a short time, maybe a month or so, and Bob, my boss. I was just showing them a spreadsheet I was working on when the computer screen went blank. After a second or so, the dreaded blue screen appeared, but it was blank. Then words began to appear in the upper left corner, one character at a time. Hey, Steve, guess who's buried here in the depths of hell and playing with the servers? Almost panicking, I quickly started typing. Sherry, I'm in the middle of something. I have people with me. Almost instantly, a message came through. Oops, sorry, folks. Official business, honestly. Steve, are we all set for today? I was surprised when my boss reached over and started typing. Hi, Sherry, it's Bob. Of course, Steve is taking you out for an evening stroll. That bastard doesn't get out much these days. A message came back. Cheers, Bob. Same place and time, Steve. And remember, my train leaves at 9. Then the screen went blank again, and then my spreadsheet reappeared. Sorry about that, I said to my boss. About what, he replied. Then he added, Nice girl, that Sherry. Our new coworker sat with a perplexed look on his face, but finally asked, Who is Sherry? Someone a little closer to your age than mine, I told him. Give it to Steve, Bob said. She's just right for you. God, you need someone to spice up your life a little. Bob, I'm 12 years older than her. So 12 years between friends? Jesus, buddy, you're too fixated on numbers. After that, we went back to the calculations in my spreadsheet, making small changes here and there, and seeing what effect they would have on the bottom line. It was probably half an hour later when the spreadsheet disappeared again, and another message appeared. Excuse me, Steve, do I need a chaperone for lunch today? He'll meet you in the reception area at 12. Bob typed the text. Thanks, Bob. Back came my spreadsheet again. Will I? I asked. Bob, probably annoyed that he'd made 2 private appointments on my behalf. Of course you will help. It was a request for help. And when have you ever said no to a lady? No matter who asked you, the old Steve would have said yes. Have I really changed that much? No more than might be expected under the circumstances, my friend. But lately we have seen the old Steve gradually returning. Now let's get on with these figures. I quickly realized why Sherry had asked me to go to lunch with her. She had her co-worker with her, who I assume had ambitions of his own. He was certainly annoyed that I was interfering with his work during their lunch break. I would say he was also disappointed to learn that Sherry and I were having dinner together in the evening, and therefore would not be traveling back with him on the same train. Sherry tried to stay on the opposite side of the table from his work colleague. Frankly, it surprised me that he didn't know what he was talking about. But maybe he was thinking too much about himself and his charms, as some young men tend to do. Later, I went down to the back where the company's servers lived, and had a few words with him when Sherry wasn't around. As I walked back up to my floor, it struck me that it had been a long time since I'd had a conversation like this with any of the Giglios in the building. When I met her in the reception area, Sherry looked as ravishing as she usually did after hours. That evening, another guard took the honor of carrying her briefcase to my car. Sherry told me that her coworker at work that day was the new guy in her company, but he knew her from college. Or rather, was well aware of what Sherry looked like in civvies, as she liked to call them. She also thanked me for everything I'd said to him this afternoon. That evening, or rather Sherry, did a little shopping and then had a quick bite to eat at a fast food joint. I was feeling pretty tired after walking through all those damn clothing stores as I put Sherry on her train that evening. Is it really so necessary for women to try on every article of clothing that catches their eye? I suppose I enjoyed watching Sherry come out of the locker room to ask me how she looked, and what seemed to be increasingly shorter skirts. You know, guys, there comes a point when you have to take the bull by the horns and say that a skirt borders on obscenity. And then, what do? They buy it. You know, if I had realized this a little earlier, I wouldn't have been so hungry when we finally hit that fast food joint. Over the next 6 months, my divorce became final, and I began to adjust to living on my own. I dated the guys from the office from time to time, but most of them were young and on the prowl. Don't think I wasn't looking because I was. It's just that I couldn't find anyone who, piqued my interest. My dates with Sherry had become routine. Don't think there was anything romantic about them, because there wasn't. Sherry would tell me how her life was going and ask me what I did in my spare time. Often she chided me for not asking this or that woman out when I mentioned them. Sherry seemed to think that if I mentioned a woman, I must be attracted to her. In a way, that was true, but I couldn't find it in me to start dating again. I felt I was too old. When I mentioned this to Sherry, she started teasing me, calling me an old man. The morning after Sherry's fall, as I was walking to the office, a newspaper headline caught my eye. It turned out that Copeland had been arrested the day before. I bought a copy and tried to read it as best I could as I went along. As is usually the case in judicially ruled Britain, the accompanying article didn't say much, only that Copeland had been arrested and charged with conspiracy and perverting the course of justice. The article went on to list a whole bunch of other people from around the country who had also been arrested. One young woman was charged with perjury on multiple counts. 5 women, described as ex-spouses, were arrested and charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice. The newspaper article mentioned that several other ex-spouses were believed to have fled the country, and extradition papers were being prepared at the time of going to press. 7 other people were charged with various offenses, including conspiracy, aiding, and abetting. The article went on to say that 12 ex-husbands deferred payment in divorce. As I understand it, this means they will be reassessed at the conclusion of the above cases. I can't claim to have followed the developments, but the gist of it was that the same young woman was appearing in numerous divorce cases around the country, claiming to have had an affair with her husbands, and in one case, her wife. In each case, the reporter cited a story very similar to what my mysterious friend had told me all those months ago, and in each case, a fairly large sum of money was involved in the settlement. Eventually, I saw my mysterious friend again. He was in the background of a news movie on television. The reporter stood on the steps of the High Court in London and announced that Copeland and his conspirators had been found guilty on all counts. The next day, Sherry came down again. I thought this was somewhat unusual because she usually came in on Thursdays and today was Tuesday. What's more, she stopped by my department and waved a pair of theater tickets in my face. "What are your plans for this evening, Steve?" "Well, it's nothing much." "Okay, you can take me to dinner and then I'll take you to the show. You'll miss the train home. I remarked. "No, I don't. There's one that leaves just after midnight. I'll catch it." After a few seconds, she added, "The last bus will be leaving by now, but Daddy will pick me up from the station. Dinner was delicious and the show was good. All in all, it was a great evening until we arrived at the train station. We both looked at the departure screen, and it turned out that there were no trains northbound until 5 in the morning. Sherry walked over to the schedule and cursed. She was wrong. All the previous trains had left a few minutes after 1 o'clock. The last one was leaving 10 minutes before 12 for some reason. "Scrummy," she said. "I'll have to stay. I'll call my old hotel and see if they have a room available," I offered. "Don't be silly, Steve. I'll lie down on your couch and catch an early train in the morning." Yes, we argued about it, but I didn't see anything wrong with her staying in my apartment if she wanted to, so we didn't make a fuss about it. No, we argued about which one of us would take the couch, and I tried to play the gentleman. In the end, Sherry outweighed all my arguments, saying she'd rather sleep on the bench at the train station than force me out of my bed. Back at the apartment, I found a spare sheet and decided to bed Sherry, using as a blanket my old sleeping bag that I kept in the car just in case. Don't forget that I had to dry it in the dryer for 20 minutes. It had been in the trunk for a very long time. While the dryer worked its wonders, Sherry and I had tea, and she took a good look around my apartment. Sherry had looked in my apartment a couple of times before, when we took home frozen food and other things I'd bought to put in the freezer. While she showered, I set up what I thought was a damn uncomfortable bed on the couch. For a short time, the heated discussion about which of us would sleep on it went back up until Sherry repeated her threat to go back to the station. After showering, we said goodnight to each other and I headed to my bedroom. I don't know what time it was when something woke me up. Yes, there was no doubt about it. Someone was blowing gently in my left ear. "Sherry," I asked. "Yes, Steve. Looks like you're in the wrong bed, young lady. Are you objecting, old man, or just stating a fact?" "Stating a fact, I think." "Good. But Sherry? Steve, if you say one word about the 12-year age difference between us, well, we're not going to start our married life on a very good foot, are we? Conjugal life? Yes. Now come on. Show me what an old man can do." I wasn't surprised when Sherry didn't rush to the train first thing. I'd already realized that she'd set me up quite effectively. As we walked to the office, Sherry explained that she was taking 4 days off to train a new set of employees in the accounts department. In fact, she didn't go home until Sunday night of that week. And she also informed me that her company had an opening that could be filled almost permanently by someone who worked at mine. Not full-time, of course, just 3 days a week, and it will be very flexible. No problem taking the kids to school and things like that at a Sherry. Kids, I guess. Of course, I want at least 2. And you'll make a great father, Steve. Gosh, that's all right then. For one awful minute, I thought you were going to say it well. See, that's what I like about you. You always see the bright side in everything. We were on our honeymoon. It was the time between sessions when you lay in each other's arms, too excited to sleep, but too tired to go again. For now, Sherry, I asked, how long were you going to be my wife? That's a good question, old man. I suppose you could say I saw a headline in the papers about your first wife and that Copeland fellow. Oh, so early? Yes. But if you were to accuse me of conniving, you might even question my motives for encouraging that fellow John to pick me up for dinner that night at the very hotel I'd chosen. I've had my eye on you for a long time. I'm going to have to keep an eye on you, aren't I? Yes, old fellow, but don't take me for Constance. I know what I want when I see it, and I'll never do anything that might mean risking losing it. Epilogue. Well, I've already mentioned that in Malta, Sherry and I ran into a very surprised June, so I suppose I should tell you what she told me. June said that she thought there was a hidden submissive streak in Constance that Copeland had somehow recognized and picked up on. June noted that reading the newspapers, she had concluded that many of the women involved in his divorce proceedings seemed to be under some sort of male influence. I have not been following the details of this case, so this was news to me. June said they all seemed to want to take full responsibility for everything, although Copeland was the only person featured in each case. I don't know what this man has, but he can get some women around his finger, June told me. But Constance has turned against Copeland and sued him, hasn't she? Remarked I. Constance is my little sister, Steve. I have always taken care of her, and perhaps that is my fault. Perhaps the fact is that Constance has always been subject to my wishes. I pushed her into that trial. I don't think she would have had the guts to see it through if it hadn't been for me. Fortunately, Copeland relented and made an out-of-court settlement. I don't know how Constance would have behaved if they had been in the courtroom. By the way, is this your new fiancé, Steve? Of course. Sherry chased me and caught me. She made a very good choice. June smiled back at me. That's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.